Radu, who's over there, and Professor Francois Gray of the University of Geneva. We also have participants from remotely joining us, and my colleague Roxana Radu and Philip Bukowinski will be moderating online, and we will be channeling in questions from online as well. So this morning we are trying to tackle some important questions related to the future of our work that are brought up by the use of data. Many of us will agree that we have entered the data-driven era. We aim for our decisions to be evidence-based. We aim to improve decisions and services based on data collection and data analysis. Big data also has become a keyword, if not to say a buzzword. Next year, the EU General Data Protection Regulation will come into effect, which adds a piece of important regulation that will affect businesses and international organizations alike, and basically affects how we all do our work. So with this, a number of important questions arise. What are we to make of this as diplomats, as people working in international organizations, and as civil society? How can we prepare for this? One answer, of course, lies in training and capacity building. And this is exactly the object of our panel today. We would like to distill lessons learned and advice for preparing ourselves for this data-driven era. To this end, we have assembled a multi-stakeholder expert panel that will address this from their various perspectives. We have with us Alberto Pace, who's the head of storage at CERN, Philippa Biggs, who is the coordinator at the Broadband Commission for Digital Development at the ITU, at the very end of the table, and then to her left is Alberto Pace. Then we have Pierre Milese, who's the Vice President for Hewlett-Packard Enterprises in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. Next to him, Heather Leeson, who is the Data Literacy Lead in the area of Policy, Strategy, and Knowledge at the IFRC. We also have part of this panel Sophie Hubert, who is the Director for the Center for Continuing and Distance Education at the University of Geneva. She's not here yet because she's stuck in the snow, but she hopes to join us as soon as possible. Before I will give the floor to our panelists for a very brief introduction and for sharing their perspectives, I would like to share with you a couple of key questions that we're trying to address today. Whose capacities are we aiming to build? What should be included in a data curriculum? What kind of issues, what kind of topics, what kind of skills should we be addressing? What are the specific needs of International Geneva in this regard? How can we make sure that we take into account that there is a digital divide that still needs to be bridged within developing this data curriculum? How can we address the specific needs of developing countries when we try to do something like this? And what do new regulatory frameworks like the GDPR bring into this whole game that we also need to take into account? So with this very brief introduction and with some key questions and key topics that we're trying to address today, I would like to hand the floor to our participants, our panelists for today. And I would like to start with Alberto Pace, who again is the head of storage at CERN.
Thank you, Katharina. So it's not easy to explain what is needed and what is happening, and what is the strategy to be effective in dealing with this big data revolution, which is affecting also many aspects of society. The most important aspect that must be probably explained is the need of the awareness of what is now becoming possible compared to what was possible only a few years ago. Clearly, there has been many technological development, and it has become clear that having data, having a lot of data, and having the infrastructure to process this data is a serious advantage to do business, but also to do politics and to be effective, because knowledge is extremely important, but knowledge that allows to also predict events. An aspect that has changed is that while this data treatment in the past was done with a deterministic approach, so the data had to be extremely formalized in order to be processed. Today, there are many, many techniques where when even the data are unreliable, for example, just generic emails or recorded conversations, the computers can make an in-depth probabilistic analysis and can find out what things are discussing and what are the important aspects that needs to be that can be extracted. So it's not extremely reliable, but when you have large amount of data, then it becomes more and more reliable. And this is also what is done in scientific research, where there are measurements. The measurements contains errors, but by doing a lot of measurements, you can really reduce the impact of the errors and obtain more and more accurate predictions. The last point was clearly that computing becomes a must-known technology, and if we go back a few years ago, knowing foreign languages was important. However, by having an interpreter, people could live without knowing foreign languages. But today, knowing computing becomes more and more important, and to understand, really to have this personal awareness of what is possible and what is not possible. And just to reassure everybody that many things that are possible today, I would have thought only 10 years ago that would never have been possible. So the world is changing very, very rapidly, and so it's never late to learn what is possible.
Thank you so much. Very interesting points, and also just listening to you, there are some things that might actually not be familiar to people, like questions of probabilistic analysis, reliability of probabilistic analysis. And I think these are things that should possibly be included in a data curriculum, just to understand the basics of, as you said, what is possible and what has been changing and what is changing so rapidly in terms of how we can create knowledge on the basis of data and new data analysis. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Philippa Bix from the ITU, who is going to share her perspective with us.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of Doreen Bogdan-Martin, head of our strategic planning and membership. So I speak probably not, well, definitely not as an education provider, but as something of an eternal student. I love studying. It's something I'm working really hard to encourage my two young daughters, the art, more of a thirst for learning than rather formal education per se. For me, any course, any data course, and I did my most recent experience was a remote statistics diploma with the Open University from the UK, and I've also had the pleasure of the advanced Oxford econometrics course, which was more Greek probably than English. But for me, any data course really it covers a number of options. Obviously, there are data techniques which are more conceptual and abstract and of broader application, but then there is also interpretation and the pitfalls of statistics and how you actually interpret the data. But most important probably is the art of asking questions and knowing which is the right question to ask, and in relation to the data you actually got. You're always constrained by what you can actually access and monitor and measure. We're seeing huge progress. There's IoT, big data. We're looking at pollution levels in Jakarta, irrigation in China's turning smart. There are fire monitoring in slums in Nairobi. So we're seeing these massive advances on the data sets available. And anybody who thinks that they're short of data, I'd encourage you to access the Facebook marketing app, because that is absolutely stuffed full of... I was recently able to find out the number of men who like men in Qatar and where they are. So there is huge strides in the data availability. The questions and what is then made, the use of those data to put to is much more scary. The Facebook Marketing Act could literally be used to organise a genocide if you were so minded. Actually, genocides happen anyway without big data, and they happen for reasons not really necessarily to do with data either. But that's there's the actual interpretation of this data is very, very significant. Talking of one recent example, in the UK, we had this mysterious £340 million a week given to the EU that was proven to be false subsequently, but it really captured the public's imagination and was arguably very instrumental in the Brexit vote. Look at the climate change argument. We're seeing a lot of information, misinformation. So for me, the fact that we live in an information era, I think we live in a propaganda era. So we really do need more informed policy making. Speaking just very briefly for Chamonix Valley, we had the simple question of a flag outside the school for days when the pollution levels are very high. And, you're talking about a red, orange and green flag. And at the end of the day, the Mary put a stop to it because they said it's going to be red too much of the time and nobody would want their children to go out. So even this is not big data, this is a flag, and we couldn't manage to get that in place because the results were too scary. So anything, a data course needs to think about how the data is used and the way in which the conclusions work out in the way it's put. Just speaking for a couple of studies, we had a fabulous conclusion in the UK that it's better to drink red wine. Red wine is good for you. And they compared all the health statistics, and they looked at people who drank red wine as opposed to beer. Now, logically speaking, there should be no difference, because if you've prorated the amount of alcohol, the health consequences should be the same. But in fact, what they were looking at was the socioeconomic groups, and the people who drink red wine tend to be middle to upper class, whereas the people who drink beer tend to be working class. So what they were actually measuring, but failed to include in that study, was their gym membership and their general approach to healthy eating, or whether you were going to have a salad with your wine as opposed to a curry with your beer. And those are the sorts of things that data courses need to take into account: the hidden pitfalls, the omitted variables. And lastly, I think there's definitely a good scope for such a course for helping us all stay in work, because as the computers and the robots take all our jobs, we are moving from an era of formal university education to one of lifelong learning. So anything you can do to make it more accessible to people who are in work to stay abreast of the latest and evolving data techniques, that would be really helpful, because we definitely need more informed diplomats, more informed policymakers. International Geneva is more in a tends to be more in an advisory capacity, but there's a big turnover, a lot of people who come here and go back or go on to. So anything that the University of Geneva can do to help people provide more better quality advice, possibly with less arrogance. We know this because my data tells me so. To encourage that healthy art of questioning is really good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting, and I like the emphasis on lifelong learning, which is something we're all doing anyway, I guess, but we probably need more of in the future. But also this question, are we asking basically the right question to our data? And what are the consequences of data analysis, and what are the implications of the knowledge we have created with this data, and to what end is it used? And these are very big questions, and a data curriculum needs to give at least, as you say, an overview of these kind of also risks associated with data analysis. I'd like to move ahead and give the floor to Heather Leaston, who is the literacy lead at the IFRC. And she is going to tell us a little bit about what the IFRC, is doing in terms of developing their own training and capacity building in the area of data.
Super. So first of all, thank you very much to Diplo Foundation and University of Geneva for inviting me in for IGF. We have completed 1 year of a data literacy program at the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. We have 190 national societies. There's 500,000 staff across all these different national societies. There's millions of volunteers. How can we be data ready? That's a large mandate. And so I've worked on data programs and data education for the last few years. I used to work in IT. So I broke it down and found a wedge, working specifically with the information management unit and the health unit. Can you hear me? Is that right? Okay, sorry. And so basically I'm interested in feeding the data curious, working with the data ready, and learn by doing. That's kind of our MO in terms of it. We have 4 streams of activity, and so today what I will share with you is 3 of those streams and then some of the challenges and opportunities embedded in terms of what are the curriculum that we've done. A couple of years ago, Bloomberg had a really great article on what is software, what is code, and it was software for managers. And it's a long read, but that's the kind of version I'm hitting at in terms of trying to reach managers. I had a very senior person in our organization say, I don't know how to read a map. And I'm like, well, first of all, thank you so much for telling me. Second of all, let's solve that problem, right? And then there's people who don't know how to add a column to an Excel diagram. And then there's people who are like, can you please find a Python course for me? So our program really is around trying to build a data culture. That's the first element. So we have a lot of leadership in terms of data. There's a lot of activities. There's a lot of super talented people in our house. We have a lower budget in terms of education. And so the first thing I did was start the informal data working group in the Geneva office and asked everybody, do you have some skills? What do you want to learn? What do you want to share? And then had informal sessions. I've had about 25 throughout the year. Some of those sessions have been remixed and done in other countries, including a basic data visualization, no laptops, no computers, humans, pieces of paper, critical thinking. And this is a course that my colleague Guido Pazzini created, and that's been really popular. So just trying to figure out how to help people have kind of a discovery channel of learning. And so while some of this stuff might sound really fluffy, on the other side of it is that we can ask and we can give people courses, but if we can build a culture around learning and a culture around data skills, where we have the finance department who have mad Excel skills teaching the health department who have mad mobile data collection skills, teaching them the different portions of it, then we can actually level our organization. That means constantly being there and constantly building different aspects of it. The biggest priority for my first year was trying to build organizational confidence and trust. You've got this. And so part of asking people to just take an online course is really it's really generous. Some people do learn that way, but we have to think about how other people learn. And so one of the biggest benefits that we've done is try and match people. So if they could have a data mentor, right? And that's really important in terms of leveling it. The second thing is around curriculum development. And when it comes to curriculum development, there's lots of activity in-house. And so I don't want to recreate a data science manual. I'm not really interested in creating how to use Excel. Excel and Microsoft has amazing courses there. It's about picking and choosing and helping people self-identify that. But a course is a flat earth model. What you really need is the people around it to kind of build that culture for it. That being said, we are building curriculum. I've user-tested a curriculum ecosystem map in Dakar, Geneva, Budapest, and Nepal. And again, I went to the same tactic. Ask people what they wanted to learn, ask them what they could share. in Nepal, in a small branch in Siddhapalchak, there was an astrophysicist who was teaching people mobile data collection. So honestly, he's got this. Like, he can teach the whole country. He's very talented, right? So first and foremost, who are those leaders and how can we give them the resources? In Nepal as well, there are some branches that just do not have access to the internet. The digital divide is a barrier for us to be able to reach people. And so what they told me was, Heather, create all this curriculum, your data basic stuff that you've been doing, your data for manager stuff, your data sharing 101. I've got all these courses and exercises for it. Responsible data, data protection 101. Put those on a flash drive, because that way we at least have it. So thinking through what people's workflows are depending on where they live is super important. We are taking these modules. I've got about 30 modules so far, created with people, user tested with their community across the world. Those modules have been tested in northern Nigeria by one of my colleagues. They've been tested in Honduras. They've been tested around the world. And our goal is, we basically tried to figure out what our skills are and what we need to learn, and then put that into a package. So we'll have a starter kit of a data playbook, and then that data playbook will then go in and have next levels up. What's important about this is that it's created by the community. Right? There's super talented people who can co-create it. We've user tested it with those folks, so now it's a matter of publishing it. And I've created a way so that people who are going to the field, they could just take it. Heather, I need a data basics 101. What is information management? Well, someone's created that. So we created a means for them to try and find that. Discoverability, again, is super important. Lastly, none of this would be possible if we didn't work with partners. And that's why I'm excited. I live in Geneva, so the idea of a curriculum partner is important. We have created this stuff for our staff, but I do believe there's a higher level of shared, I work from the open source world for many years. There's a shared curriculum that could happen, right? Just because I've created data for managers, and there's humanitarian examples, does not mean we cannot take out the humanitarian examples and put in the other examples. And I think there's a huge opportunity for this community to do that. We've created partners with Missing Maps, which is a global community of map makers where people can learn about humanitarian response while making and building a map. We work with MIT Media Lab. They have some amazing free courses online. We've been prototyping something called Data Basics. You were talking earlier, Philippa, about asking questions. They have a whole module on asking questions. So we actually did that in our workplace. They have one about raising questions and trying to build a response. We've done that. So that'll be more and more pushed out. And I would say that if you can find those partners who already have the curriculum, great. There's lots to be done. We also partner with UN OCHA, with the Humanitarian Data Exchange, and working through the workflows of how do we share data. Because while we can talk about the data sets and how much data we have in big data, what I really love is small data. Small data is really important to be able to people do their jobs. And so if we can work with partners like HDX to train and do that, we have. And we've done it in Dakar, we're doing it in Nairobi, we're going to do it in Jakarta again, and about building a common curriculum that we can co-share. And so just to say that we have had a number of challenges in terms of trying to build out this curriculum. I'm one person, that's one challenge. The second challenge is that I rob and steal. So how I've dealt with that is I rob and steal from other departments. Hi, can I borrow the staff member for a while? And so you just find your allies. The skills and competencies are so dispersed. Right? For somebody senior to tell me they don't know how to read a map, and somebody quite junior saying, hi, can you help me with my spreadsheet? That's important. So we do need kind of a service desk model of more people training and more people understanding and helping with that kind of data vulnerability. Building the global spaces for people to have the content. As I said, I have to put things on flash drives. We are testing out online course platforms. People learn different ways. I've created scenarios and session designs. A responsible data session that we have for data protection is a simulation to walk through the data set, to make decisions, and to ask people what roles, responsibilities, and risks. And so having a sense of play while you're building things has been really critical for us. Translation, technology, and lastly, data is about feelings. When I say data is about feelings, it's about a feeling of change, right? And it's a feeling of, can I do this? What is my responsibility to that? Will I be respected if I make the wrong decision? And so it's about a human behavior activity, which is why I focus so heavily on culture. And so while I say that curriculum is really important, curriculum was only as good as the people around it. And so I think that that's why you need a network. And so thank you.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting to hear very practical experiences from you from developing this curriculum. Two things I picked up is the importance of building a data culture in an organization. And the other thing, that there are very different needs within each organization, and the question is, how are we meeting these needs? How can we meet these needs within one curriculum? Is, in that sense, one curriculum even enough? Having said that, I'd like to hand the floor to Pierre Melese from Hewlett-Packard, who is going to share his perspective, and here, importantly, the perspective of the business sector. So please.
Thank you. So it's Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And in my role, I consult government, nations, and cities about their IT strategy. Interestingly, IT stands for information technology. Information is really becoming core to the proper functioning of government, cities, and nation. And over the past years, we have lived through an explosion of information and data being thrown at us. And you can see this as an opportunity or as a real challenge. If we back up, just in 2011, the German government came to the Hanover Fair and talked about Industry 4.0. And if you look at the nature of that term, it actually is all about the automation of the industry and the ingestion of a lot of data that transforms the industry. I think we've come to a place now where governments and cities are getting to their own revolution of 4.0. It's a digital disruption which is based on obviously a lot of data, more data being available. It is all of us creating this data with our mobile phones. Over 50% of the internet traffic now comes from mobile phones. Not only do we consume information through mobile phones, but we create a lot of information. It's not just the pictures that we take, it's also the location where we are. It's the interaction we have with the services that we consume from government or private sector. So that information and that data is becoming bigger. We've talked about big data. But it also has some other attributes. It is becoming richer information in the form of images, in the form of sounds. It is not automatically structured data. It can also be unstructured data. It is also said that this information is forever. I mean, there's obviously the right to be forgotten, but data tends to be persistent until you actually decide to delete it. And another interesting factor that contributes to that explosion of data is the everything connects. It's not just us connecting with our friends or business partners. It's machines and things connecting between each other to not just recreate the information in a different place, but also make new data out of the existing data. This is what machines do with machine learning, artificial intelligence, being able to make decisions based on the information that is being analyzed and ingested. Another element fundamental to Industry 4.0 or Government 4.0 is the need to have immediate response or immediate action based on the information that is ingested. So, take, for example, a city that feels that it has a lot of traffic or a lot of pollution can immediately, from its sensors, have a reaction to reduce the speed limit of the cars through that city. If a city has nobody walking through the streets, the sensors could feel that and decide to reduce the light in that city. And if you want, that city becomes obviously consumes less energy. At the same time, it becomes almost like a living organism that immediately reacts to the information that it collects. So information is exploding. It comes with the challenges of privacy, of data sovereignty. It comes with challenges of security. Am I at risk of being attacked in something that creates prosperity for my country or my city? Or do I put at risk my citizen with the information that suddenly is becoming core to the way that I function, either as an industry, as a city, or as a nation? So there are really big opportunities as people depend more on data to create prosperity, but as well big risk because that data, that information is being targeted and is a potential threat to the functioning, the proper functioning of our societies.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you for giving us a sense of the different kinds of data we're dealing with within this data explosion and the kinds of implications such as privacy and data sovereignty. So last but not least, our final panelist, Sophie Hubert, was able to join us. She's the director of the Center for Continuing and Distance Education at the University of Geneva, and I would like to hand the floor to her. Unfortunately, she's situated over there, so if you can direct your attention here, please.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for being late. It's like the snow falls for the first time in Geneva. Listening to you, I realized that the way I framed my short introduction this morning actually very well connects with lessons learned also in your experiences. Actually, in late 2015, somehow once upon a time, feels already quite late, a tale started at the University of Geneva. We started putting our heads together from different disciplines, colleagues, professors, but also researchers, some of them having really nice connections to enterprises or to institutions, be they international institutions or NGOs. And we were wondering, actually, how could we better actually answer training needs. From our point of view, and this is where the tale really started, we learned 3 lessons, and there was one central character within that tale. That central character was a sort of a Vitruvian man, you know, where, like on the Da Vinci map, where the man has the perfect proportions, and he also is the center of all digital action and thought. So in our thinking, we realized first that a lot was already happening at the university, especially in terms of continuing education. So addressing only professionals who were already on the job, who had been 5, 10, 15 years on the job. For some of them had already a university background. So a lot was happening at the university in different disciplines, different faculties. Of course, with our colleagues from science and informatics, but also with our colleagues from health and in communication and social sciences, etc., etc. So that was really lesson number 1, almost like Heather said. There was a lot already within the institution to offer as training. No, lesson number 2 was that we realized that in our picturing of that data officer or that data scientist, as we coined him at some point, we really were talking about one of those Vitruvian men. Someone who, on the one hand, could collect data, knew those methods very well, knew what technologies were available, knew what questions to be asked. That was one hand. The second hand of that man or woman was how to protect that data. That person would also know exactly the internal governance regulation within an institution, knew the technology that were out there to protect the data, and possibly, as in the EU GDP regulation, would also be the future link to an authority. No, collection and protection of data were 2 elements. The 2 last ones were analysis of that data, of course. Again, that perfect man or woman would know all the methods and would also understand the purposes of asking questions to that data. Purposes for business development or purposes for policy making, be it again in health, migration, etc., etc. No, the last branch or arm of this man or woman was communication, of course. Communication internally or externally of what came out of this data gathering and data analysis. Again, that perfect person would know exactly the tools and techniques to communicate, know how to visualize, and know specifically the essential messages to address to different sets of audiences. So really a perfect man, that was or woman. That was the data officer we had in mind. And then, starting calculation, we realized that, of course, we had let's say, the training offer there, but adding them all so that ideal man or woman could be created would be a very lengthy process, about 3 years of training, even part-time, but a good 3 years. So that was lesson number 3. It was just impossible. We could, of course, reformat, compact those curricula. We could try and change the format of it, putting all digital if possible. But there was also another thinking on the way, and that was within those curricula, know better about the training needs of those people who would come to the university, understand them well, and let them somehow create a sort of a personalized curriculum within that offer, making sure that on the way it wouldn't just be a patchwork of elements, but still a strong and structured learning journey, out of which they could come, you know, with diploma if needed. It exists in the Swiss environment, diplomas of continuing education, diplomas that could be then valued as credentials all over the world. But somehow, the end of the tale is also that there may not be one of these virtual men, right? There may not be. What may be needed is actually more mainstreaming of capacity in networked organizations where a number of colleagues do actually possess parts of those competencies and capacities, while at the same time understanding what their colleagues needs. And hence, it would be a team of Virtuvian women and men rather than just one person. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reminding us that this is a multidisciplinary effort, that we already have a lot of data, but also a lot of expertise in our organizations. But more importantly, if you want to combine all the necessary skills in one person, we're looking for a perfect person that does not exist as such. So thank you to our panelists for giving us a very varied overview of the kinds of questions, the kinds of issues, the kinds of key points that we need to keep in mind. It is very broad, as expected. With that in mind, I would like to open up the floor directly to questions from the audience. What kind of struck you as particularly interesting? Is there anything you would like to follow up on? What is your own experience with learning about data analysis, integrating data into your organizations?
Hi, my name is Saeed, and I come from Afghanistan. One thing that I noticed that we don't talk about usually when we talk about data, and that is the level of error that we receive from within the data. What we see, what we generally talk about data is that this glorified data, that everything is so accurate, everything is so perfect, that there is no margin of error. But when we see actually that there's a lot of error within the data, and also the level of error when we analyze the data, and also the error when we make decisions about the data. So my question is, in general, if for example, HP or the other organization working on the technologies, if you have considered including the level of error, and if not in terms of percentage, but how does that impact our decisions at the end?
Thank you so much. My feeling is it's a good question for Alberto or Pierre, if you...
I'm sorry, what was your name and where do you come from?
My name is Saeed, from Afghanistan.
Okay. In terms of error, I think it really depends on the type of data that we're talking about. For example, if you take face recognition, there's no 100% certainty in face recognition. Now, there are systems that allow you to capture images of faces that could be installed throughout a city that would help accelerate the capture of somebody that the police is searching. But there's never 100% certainty of that face recognition. You always come to more certainty. It's a bit like translating software that we use in this conference that we can see in front of us. It's never 100% perfect. It gets close, but it's never 100% perfect. So you always have to keep that in mind when you look at data. Now, there is some perfect data. There is some data that is binary when it's very structured and very well understood. I think things that will improve on the precision is computation. Everything will compute. Over time, more things will compute to bring higher level of certainty. Everything will connect, and by the intercorrelation of multiple data points, you'll be able to have better clarity about what you're measuring. And hopefully, you know, the IT industry, but all of us, will aim to have everything understood. And you know, when I say have better certainty, take the GPS, for example. And you know, initial findings of GPS, the precision was not very big. But if you're able to have intercorrelation between GPS and other systems, plus the cell towers, then suddenly your position, your geographical position, will be known very, very thinly. So the increase of measuring device will allow us to have more precision on the things that we're measuring, but never 100% certainty. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Heather, you want to come in?
Sure. Thank you. Perhaps when you're speaking, if you can push up the volume if you're a soft talker, that's always helpful. When it comes to, you know, reliability of data, we have to go back to the data users, right? And I'm just going to give an example of a community-based surveillance program that we do for response, and that's for pandemic response. And so the community itself got feedback on the quality of the data, right? This is what's accurate, this is not what's accurate. So when thousands of points of data is educated from the front, then you can get accuracy, and then you can improve the computerization of it or the use in technology. But if you don't have the front end taught, then you're still going to have a data quality issue, right? And I think the important thing is that when you're talking about data consumers and data producers, when you're talking about communities who are creating this data, so for example, I'm a humanitarian, when they're creating this data, if you don't tell them what you did with the data, if you don't tell them why you're taking the data, if you don't tell them how you can improve the data, then you won't be able to get to a point of accuracy. And so it's about educating around data quality as well as working with the systems and tools. Software is software. If you don't have human behavior addressed on top of it with that, then the software will detect that there's a problem, but you're still going to have the human API, the human application protocol interface, if you will, to be able to go back in and recharge it. But I do think that quality software can show us where the validation points are so that we can go back. So as you look through that, you can get reports and say, okay, well, this is where you need to improve. And that in itself is why we need both. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have also questions from online. So let us bring them in, because I'm sure they have been waiting for quite a while.
Thank you very much. We do have a question from our online participants, from Laurence. He's asking, could we make such a data curriculum mandatory for all government members?
I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and somebody from ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, and he said that when you come to the organization, you have to learn how to change a tire. And I love that. I said, well, we need a data first aid, right? First aid is like very important for everybody in the humanitarian field to know. Everybody in office needs it. What is the onboarding for that? And so I would say like this kind of curriculum discussion is really important. And while we go through the HR protocols of bringing people in, it has to be sustainable. So what's your data safety check? Have you upgraded your data skills? You know, these are things that we can kind of do organizationally. And so, yeah, does the government need to have data skills? I think everybody has different kinds of data skills. It's just, first of all, you know, checking that and also helping them rather than penalizing people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, I see two. Okay, let's start over here and then.
Hello, my name is Ernest. I represent Freedom House delegation. I'm wondering about that. Actually, I have no fear about the future and children being engaged with new technologies and spend more time indoor rather than outdoor, as soon as it also correlates with the lack of street crime or just decrease in number of such crimes. But at the same time, I was wondering about the transparency and the perspective, the future, how the private sector sees the provision of the transparency of keeping data safe and how to ensure that it's not being misused by in such a manner like data mining or something that would harm or even affect the behavior of the consumer. And I was wondering that that's actually it's not the government, it's not also for private sector to keep these data safe, but it's for everyone, for public, and must be just transparency being provided. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if I can speak for all of the public sector. I would say it is our joint responsibility to put in practice some data protection policies. The government from a law, from a governance standpoint, like it is the case in the EU with the GDPR, for example, or data residency, but also for the private sector to conform with those laws. I would say, there are some best practices to be thought of for cities, governments, organizations, such as having a CIO, Chief Information Officer, that is on top of those notions, that is able to guide the government through the proper curriculum. I agree, there's a need for a curriculum. There is absolutely a gap of understanding of the challenges and opportunities that data and insights coming from the data can represent for our nation. I would say it's also important beyond a curriculum to have a board, an advisory board or a collaboration board inside a government, inside a nation, so that people share the evolution. We're talking technology here. The fundamental about technology is that it evolves all the time, both the threats and the capability. And government not just need to have a good understanding of what technology can provide today and what is the governance today, but also to keep an ongoing conversation between itself, the different stakeholders, but also with the private sector to understand what new threats might be at hand and what new protections might be at hand and what new capabilities can help generate new prosperities. Data and information is the new currency for both the good guys and for the bad guys. So we have to work together between governments and the private sector to be able to come with the right policies and make those policies respected.
Thank you. It's a good reminder that a data curriculum is needed, and then the question of a chief information or a chief data officer. There was another question at the very back. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Johnny Penn. I'm from the University of Cambridge, and I'm a Google Technology Policy Fellow at the European Youth Forum. My question is, I'm on a bit of a fact-finding mission. It seems to me that if civil society is asked to prototype solutions for data management, all across the continent and around the world, there will be a lot of wasted energy because people will be working on the same problems, and they maybe aren't able to share their solutions without a standardized language. Have you come across anything like this, any proposals about how civil society can standardize the sort of techniques they use so that they all benefit from each other's work and all grow equally?
Well, I think in science it depends on the sector, but for example in physics there are very, very well consolidated standards where the worldwide physics community is working together, constantly sharing data using well consolidated standards. This approach has been, there are many efforts to extend this approach also to biology and medicine. Of course, the major problems in this approach, in sharing the data on consolidated standards, is the respect of the privacies. So immediately, as soon as the scientists ask hospital to have access to even anonymized data from patients, it becomes very, very easy to understand that even if the data are anonymized, with the technique of big data and really understanding, the correlations of various aspects, is sometimes rather easy to avoid the effort of making the data anonymous. So it's a good example where clearly there are conflicting interests. There is the need of maybe science to have access to all the data, and the need of respecting the privacy of the population. And this also comes back to the previous questions, where there may be conflicting interests between maybe what the private sector and would like to be able to do with in terms of data processing, compared to what the privacy of the individual would require. And that's where the importance of the curriculum of the people in the governance area is is crucial to decide how far things can go and where they should stop.
Thank you. I think that's a really important question, and we actually have several panelists who have something to say, so thank you for the question. And first, I'd like to hand the floor to Philippa and then Heather.
Yeah, that's a very intriguing question, but mainly because I'm not entirely too sure what, who you're referring to with civil society, because they're not that organised necessarily. They don't necessarily have the data capacity or resources. Obviously, in the UK, the NHS handed over a whole bunch of medical records without consent of patients to DeepMind for a very noble purpose, looking at kidney failure diagnosis. But of course, there was a lot of other information in those records, and you can't entirely be sure the purpose for which that is going to be used for. I was interested in doing DNA analysis recently with ancestry.co.uk, and they have a very nice long legal agreement entitled privacy agreement. So it, very good feel-good factor associated. And when you read this agreement, which took some time, basically the whole gist of it is that you were passing across your biomedical information. Your saliva sample would go to the States, where it would be held indefinitely. It wouldn't be used for the purpose stated and then destroyed. It was going to be held indefinitely, and they guaranteed the privacy of that sample for the time which they owned the subsidiary in the States. But as soon as that subsidiary would be bought out, the sample and the ownership rights and the information associated with the sample would be passed to whoever owned that company. So basically, the net effect was you were signing away the privacy rights to your DNA information in an agreement that was clearly stated, privacy agreement. And of course, you don't know to what purpose that sample is going to be used. We have lung cancer in my family. If I thought that would help find a cure for lung cancer, I would be the first to volunteer my sample. If it's to design the next generation of bioweapons, biological warfare, no thank you. But you don't actually get to decide what that information is used for. And once it's in the public domain, or in the private domain, but to be bought out by God knows who, so a lot of this privacy is a lot, it's almost a sort of oasis in the desert, false illusion that is creating feel-good factors among the users, when in fact you're entirely in arguments with the lawyers over who owns what.
So I think your question is really about standards and sharing. And so in my background, I've been around a lot of different civil society groups. And so I guess when it comes to standards, I think that the humanitarian data exchange with the humanitarian exchange language has a tagging system and a taxonomy available for how we share data and what practices for it. The number of organizations who have data sets there in terms of being transparent is important. There's also a data trail included with it so that you know what the agency of it is and where it goes. And so it's important to anybody who's creating a data set to have that kind of data trail there. In addition to other standards out there, there's more education happening. I really love what Stanford PACS is doing. That's the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society. Last year they had a digital world tour. They went around the world. All the videos are online, around the world, talking to activists, civil society, government, business. We were all in the same room. I went to the London event, talking about what are the shared curriculum, what are the practices, what are the lessons learned, what are the best practices around data and data use. That's really important that organizations and universities get on board and work with businesses and partners and researchers. Absolutely critical, and foundations, of course. The other groups that are doing really good in terms of education, Responsible Data Forum, MIT Media Lab I already mentioned. Wellcome Trust is working on a sharing agreement around healthcare data and how do we share it. UNHCR is working, there's a collective of us who are working on how do we share data and the protocols of it, which is why I created a bunch of modules around what is the questions we need to ask before we share data to be responsible. All of this to say that there are a number of different avenues and organizations that are doing that, but there's no one place. Another one is Civicus. Civicus is a massive civil society organization, and they have a whole program called Data Shift, and they've worked with a group called Engine Room. And so all these resources are there, but the problem is that I just listed off at least 15 organizations, and I can do that because I've worked in this space, but if you're a smaller NGO or a small civil society, you kind of need a guidebook for all the tools that are out there already, and how do you access it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about a guidebook that might be needed to navigate not even the data or data analysis, but the organizations that actually deal with data analysis that we can draw on. Other questions from the floor? If not, oh, yeah.
François Gray from the University of Geneva, and I just wanted to ask two questions of the panel. First of all, thanks to Diplo Foundation and Geneva Internet for putting this panel together. I think this is a great opportunity to hear from a diverse group in Geneva. Geneva is, you know, at one sense ordinary. It's a small city in Europe, and the other sense extraordinary. There's all these international organizations here, and we at University of Geneva are in the middle of a strategy process, thinking what can we do better in terms of our education offering for international Geneva, for many of you on the panel and in the room. So the two questions are, I think it's been very nicely illustrated here, that there are certain silos of knowledge within our city here, and you know, what could we do to be better to break those down and collaborate on these issues of curricula for data and data governance and data officers. And the other question is, looking outside Geneva, who are the partners both to be collaborating with, and who should we be offering education to around the world? What should our role be? So these are two questions which I'd like you to respond to.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you for bringing us back to International Geneva and the very specific context that we're operating in here and the very specific needs related to that. So I'll hand the question over to our panelists.
Okay, so I think you know, this is absolutely a fantastic question. As you mentioned, in Geneva, there are incredible talents and great minds coming together. And I think an institution such as the University of Geneva could bring us all together to think about what would be the right curriculum for states, for governments, thinking about how data and information can improve governments' resilience. Resilience in a world that is increasingly using data as you know, as an asset or as a weapon. How can government improve their prosperity? As I mentioned earlier, data is the new currency. and creates wealth, but also is a vulnerability. And then how can we collaborate better? Thinking about standards of collaboration and how data fits into this. But, you know, if you take it one more level, Geneva is one of the three headquarters of the United Nations, and the United Nations go with the SDGs. So what is the role of data within those SDGs, and how can we, coming together between civil, private society, academic, think about providing the right curriculum and the right guidance for some of the leaders out there when they think about the SDGs and how data and information can help them tackle those challenges?
Yes, thanks, Francois, for your question. I would like to say maybe two elements coming to the silos and bringing them down. It's fascinating how we all speak of ecosystems and how rich those ecosystems are actually, because they are competencies and experiences and standards, etc., out there. But when we try and change those ecosystems from passive to active, that's when we actually come to the crux of the negotiation, which is within that ecosystem, different actors work with very different purposes and under very different conditions. And somehow, especially under the SDGs, if there's one opportunity to move beyond those, you know, and see only the final point of the SDGs, that may be fine. I've been working for, I would say, 10 years now in International Geneva, always from an educational point of view, trying from time to time, you know, different opportunities to mobilize those ecosystems, changing them from passive to active. And it's always been a lesson in humility of how difficult and how much energy you need to put into an ecosystem to create a momentum and keep it on. Right now, there's one experiment which is not immediately related to International Geneva data, but it's that project Best for Geneva coming in from an NGO who started to actually mobilize the ecosystem. And I'm quite, I must admit, weary and interested to see how much the ecosystem will then be mobilized. So I feel there's a need at some point for a strong and very positive external leverage to mobilize an ecosystem. And I'm just wondering whether we, within International Geneva, are enough to do that.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. I'm not entirely sure. I think the UN, you know, has a very, very well organized lot of statisticians working on data collection for the SDGs. So I'm, other than providing sort of general statistical capacity, that's a very, very huge, overly huge process. I'm not entirely sure I see a huge need to step in there. What I think would be most interesting in taking on with a data course would be a couple of the mindsets. So the fact that training, oh, boring, it's obligatory, I've got to do this, but it's not going to be any relevant, you know, to me, that would be good to address. The fact that statistics is some kind of weird specialist alchemy that involves years of learning and you know, only the super duper mathematicians can do it, that would be good to address. And basically, I personally would see the biggest need in trying, there's a lot of admin jobs in government in Geneva that are going to disappear in the next 15 years. And those people, once they leave the workforce, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to get back in. So honestly, if I was thinking of what the University of Geneva could very usefully contribute, it's not really worrying about the super-duper mathematicians because they're all going off to work for the merchant banks these days. Nicholas Negroponte from MIT, he was saying, I used to get 50 good PhD students a year, you know, 10 of which would work on really big problems, solving the world poverty. He says, now I get 49 who go off to do some stupid startup with a boyfriend, girlfriend, neighbour, and only one goes into working on, big questions. And so the University of Geneva, yes, you could cater to the advanced doctoral students, but honestly, I would think there's actually a really big, or there's going to be a very big need for your middle-class admin person who knows how to handle basic bookkeeping software, but not much more than that. And if you were to train them up to the fact their job simply isn't going to be there by the time artificial intelligence takes over, and what are they going to do that they could contribute, that is a really big question that a lot of societies, including rich banking Geneva, are going to be facing in the next 10 years. So a little bit of advanced thought about that would be really helpful.
Well, I'm scared to work at a bank now. I've actually never worked at a bank. I worked at an oil company before and an IT company, but not a bank. In relation to your two questions, how do we work with International Geneva and how do we work globally? I'm glad you brought that up. There is this thing called the internet, right? And I think that, we have to learn like the internet. We have to work like the internet in some ways. And while I put technology in front of that sentence, I should be clear that there's humans who use that, right? And so here we are at the IGF, so let's just kind of honor that sentence. So I think there's kind of four approaches. One is about discoverability, right? And so I just listed off a bunch of organizations who have training materials, but we can't necessarily access that. So doing an ecosystem map of what's available and, vetting it and being able to say, okay, this is all created, what else needs to be created? That's the first step. Second one is about modularized learning, and I think that self-serve module around I need this today. And so I've created a little bit of that where people can say, you know what, Heather, I need X, and so I have something on that, or I can go work with people to create it. And we have a wide network of people within our organization who have things. And then we ask within our organization, but we also act externally. People who are working in data literacy or data education, it's a small town, right? And so I think that's exciting because things like the Center for Humanitarian Data become focal points, where if we're working in humanitarian response or if we're working in other groups. Yesterday I was at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and they're all thinking about digital literacy. Well, data literacy is just one of it. So there's these large institutions who are working on this, so we could partner with them. The third one is about social learning. There's, as one of you said, there's lots of talented people here in Geneva. So what I've done is I've never hired anybody to come into IFRC to do a data training course. We have used our own capacity. And what I've done is found those people and they self-identified, or we found them and hunt them down and asked them to do a training class. And that kind of social learning and skill sharing was really helped us as an organization change. And so International Geneva could help us with that. By all means, bring in the experts, but also think about what's your network of, hey, do you know how to use Python? Do you know how to use R? I have this quick question. And the UN has created something called the Information Management Working Group. There's 600 of us on this Skype group. I know it's very loud. But if you had a question about information management in the international space for humanitarian response, there's a network of people to do that, and that's a beautiful gift. And lastly, none of this is possible without a little bit of community management and engagement. Somebody has to be the fire starter. Somebody has to find those ambassadors. Somebody has to make sure that the community norms are available, that somebody's not over-talking or that they're maybe minimizing someone's skills or whatever. And as we go through so much change in organizations, as Philippa said, we have to be ready for the fact that this is really going to be hard for some people. And, we want to make it a generous and fun thing, but also to be able to help organizations modernize and be ready for some of the risks, as Pierre said. Thank you.
Thank you. As the session draws to a close, last chance for any questions from the floor. Good. Then I would like to hand over to each of our panelists for a kind of final word, kind of final reflection on the things we have been discussing this morning, on their own experiences, on maybe things that have shifted in their minds after coming together here and having this discussion, on the kind of things they perceive as the next steps for all of us or as the next steps for themselves. So it would be great to hear from you as a kind of final reflection, wrap up. And I think I start over here, and then we just go around.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm gonna leverage your idea of changing one specific mindset, which is knowledge or learning is definitely not boring. It's fun. It brings you forward. Of course, you need to know why you're doing it and see some return on education. So maybe there's more on us to prove again that there's relevance in coming back to a university. There's relevance in spending some time back into learning, and there's impact. And if not only for yourself or your career, there's impact for your family, for your community, and for a sort of a greater good. So on that, I think we can definitely go and be better and do better, while at the same time making our curriculum as flexible as possible and go into some sort of coaching of people when they come in, rather than just putting them into a set curriculum. Thanks.
So mainly I take away a lot of encouragement, and I'm very heartened that the brain power around this table is clearly intent on collaborating and each party bringing what they do best to the table. So I think this is a very promising initiative, and I would love to follow it more closely.
Probably what came out from the last questions was the importance of education in this very quickly changing environment. We have seen that the data becomes more and more unstructured, unreliable, and then we use computers to improve the reliability of the predictions, but this awareness that these predictions may be false sometimes is forgotten. So then there are processes that takes what the computer has concluded as the best probable issue as the truth, and sometimes this is extremely wrong, especially when we move from statistical numbers, which are certainly correct, into individual cases. And this is where the awareness of the governance to protect the individuals and the individual privacy is essential. There are many examples where things can go wrong if people forget this. Statistics shows that in Switzerland the majority of people speaks German, but this does not mean that everybody in this room speaks German, and so it's this type of generalizations that are applied to the individual that can have very dramatic consequences.
Yeah, for final comments, I'd like to leave with some thoughts and maybe some recommendations. Well, the first one is train yourself. As a leader that you are in your organization, it's important to personally invest time into your own education about the topic. This is a very important one that will drive your organization or your personal growth or not. The second one is, as a leader of your organization or being part of a team, is create a framework for innovation. Data will can provide prosperity, can provide a better resilience of an organization, and that framework should also be one that is open. There are doubts in certain nations or cities that data should be open. I tell you, when you look at the most successful cities and nations around the world, those that have approached an open way to data are the ones that are creating the best success for their citizen. The third one is we should not be scared. I heard the comment earlier that Mr. Negroponte said, "Oh, my scientists, they want to go and create their own startup." Well, you know what? Startups do solve big world problems. They actually create solutions in collaboration with governments and with civil society to address some of the biggest challenges. Some of the biggest companies in the world today were just startups 10 years ago. And they've created prosperity and for many folks. New jobs have been created by data that didn't exist 10 years ago. Data scientists, IT architects, technology offices, but also some low wages jobs such as Uber drivers or Careem drivers in the Middle East, Airbnbs, you might be an Airbnb entrepreneur yourself, YouTubers, some of your kids or family members are there and creating data and information. So we should embrace it, because if you look at the fear of jobs being eliminated by data, well, it's the nature of society that jobs evolve. Look at the early 18th century. Most of us were, at the time, peasants or in the military. And now, you know, most of us are in the service world. Well, the world is transforming. There's a new IT revolution, a new world revolution going on before our eyes. And true, jobs will shift. And for us and our kids to take advantage of those new capabilities, we have to go to retrain ourselves or to train ourselves on what matters. And I think the topic today was very well defined. Thank you.
So here we are. We're at the Internet Governance Forum. We're civil society, we're government, we're universities, we're humanitarians. Which group did I miss out? Business. How did I miss business? Oh, my friend. You know, we need all of these different components to be able to deal with data gaps. And while I agree with Pierre that there's so much opportunity, I'm a humanitarian. We are leaving people behind with data. There are data gaps. There's data education gaps. And so, yes, focusing on the leaders, working with UN World Economic Forum, global shapers, they're working around the world, working on digital revolution, trying to help people. But we also need the IGF, Internet Society ambassadors who are running around with blue T-shirts. We need those people to be data ready, right? We need the small civil society groups to be able to work on that. So a shared curriculum, of course, is very important in it. That will only happen in these kind of multi-stakeholder places, and that will only happen in partnership. Now, we at the Red Crescent, we have worked with business, we work with universities, we work with civil society groups. We do that because we have many problems to solve, and to work in partnership with local communities who are sometimes very data ready. But if we don't actually think through how we make sure that that gap is addressed while we're going to chasing the big data, chasing the new algorithms, which I think is exciting, believe me, I'm a little bit of a data cowboy too. But, and I'm from Western Canada, so I'm allowed to say cowboy. But the idea that we are making a digital divide and a data divide, that is the most frightening thing that I think we in any curriculum should look at. So while we take care of the leaders and we train with International Geneva, here at the IGF, I would ask you for the rest of the week, what are you going to do in order to build those conversations to address the digital divide and the data divide? How will you go home and implement that? Thank you.
Thank you. This is the end of the session, so I'd like to start by thanking the audience for being here early this morning, for fighting the snow and fighting fatigue. Most importantly, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their perspective and their varied views and from their very different backgrounds, from their very different kinds of experiences with working with data, with trying to establish a data curriculum. This has been extremely exciting. And I think the most important thing as we move forward is this point of this question is very exciting because it affects all areas of society. It affects all of us in our work life, in our private life. And it calls for multidisciplinary approaches, working across different organizations, different sectors. So it's really something that we all need to come together on, because otherwise we have no chance in understanding data properly, using it properly, and putting it to good use in various areas in the humanitarian sector, in the business sector, and so on. So thank you so much. And I think this calls for more work and more intense focus on what can we do to train people and to raise awareness and to all come together and work together. So,
I quoted Professor Negroponte, and obviously he's not here to. I was just sharing his concerns. It wasn't. I didn't put any. I presented it verbatim, as he said it in our meeting, and so you know, the fact that Professor Negroponte is concerned about doctoral students, I'm sure, you know, coming from MIT, this probably is the next Uber, but it was his concern. So I just want to clarify that it wasn't me spinning it or anything.
Can I add just one word of thanking the organizers here and the Geneva Internet Platform, which is already doing a great deal to bring together international Geneva around these issues. And just saying that you're wondering about the data from this session, well, thanks to GIP, this will be inserted into the University of Geneva's digital strategy, and it's an online platform open to everyone. You can add ideas for our strategy. It's unigi.lumio.ge, and I'll leave some cards here if you want to contribute. So thanks again to GIP.
Thank you. Speaking of that, we also have my colleague Barbara Rosen-Jacobson in the room, who has been taking notes. There will be a report from this session on the Digital Watch, which is an initiative of the Geneva Internet Platform. So she will provide a detailed summary of the whole discussion, which is a challenge, I'm sure, but it will be very valuable for us to move ahead. So thank you so much.